At 72 years old, 3 hours before my granddaughter's wedding, my own daughter looked me straight in the eye and said, "Dad, you'll ruin the photos. Please, just sit at the back and try not to draw attention." Can you imagine that being told by the very child you raised, clothed, and fed for decades that you're nothing but a blemish on the picture she wants to show the world? That's exactly what happened to me. But here's the part she didn't know. I had 70 million reasons to smile when she said it. My name is Howard Whitaker. I'm 72 years old, born and raised in Boulder, Colorado. For over 40 years, I was a construction man. Not the kind who just draws blueprints from behind a desk. No, I was out there on job sites in the snow, in the heat, on scaffolds before sunrise. I built bridges, schools, even 2 churches in this very state. My company started with nothing more than an old pickup truck and a set of steel-toed boots. By the time I was 68, it had grown into one of the largest contracting firms in the Rockies. When my wife passed, I couldn't stand the noise of business anymore. I sold the company quietly. No big announcements, no headlines. The check they wired to my account came to $70 million after taxes. I didn't tell a soul. Not Dana, not Eli, my daughter and her husband, not even my granddaughter Isabel, the bride we were celebrating that day. Why keep it a secret? Because money does strange things to people. I wanted to see how my family would treat me when they thought I was just old Howard in the mountain cabin, a man scraping by on his pension. And I'll tell you, friend, it didn't take long for me to see their true colors. They never invited me to restaurants unless I was paying. They never asked me to sit at the front of family photos. Eli, my son-in-law, once joked that my clothes looked like hand-me-downs from Goodwill. I laughed it off, but it stung. Still, I bit my tongue. Because Isabel was the one bright spot in all this. That girl used to visit me in the summers, helping me sand wood on the porch, eating pancakes with me every Sunday morning. She had kindness in her eyes, the kind her mother lost somewhere along the way. So when the wedding came around, I thought, maybe this is my chance to give her something beautiful, something that will set her life on solid ground. I prepared a wedding gift that would change everything, a check for $5 million tucked in a simple white envelope. But then 3 hours before the ceremony, Dana said those words, "Dad, you'll ruin the photos." And Eli stood behind her nodding like some polished banker in his suit that probably cost more than my truck. I smiled, but inside me something shifted. Because here's the truth. You can forgive small slights. You can swallow casual insults. But when your own child tells you to hide as if your face, your presence, your very existence is an embarrassment that cuts deeper than any nail or steel beam I ever carried. And it made me wonder, maybe Isabel didn't need a $5 million gift to start her marriage. Maybe what this family needed was a lesson about respect. So I made a choice that day. I would walk into that ballroom in my old navy blue suit, the same one I wore to Dana's college graduation, and I would hold my head high. I wouldn't argue, I wouldn't fight. I'd let them play their games with their cameras and their aesthetic. And then, when the time came for the father of the bride to speak, I would show them exactly who they had tried to erase. I'll ask you this. Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong in your own family? If so, then you'll understand what I felt in that moment. And let me tell you the story that unfolded inside that $65,000-a-night hotel ballroom. It's one they'll never forget as long as they live. I'll be honest with you. When Dana told me I was an embarrassment, my first instinct was anger. A younger man might have snapped back, might have raised his voice in that gilded hallway. But at 72, I've learned that words said in heat don't solve anything. So instead, I did what I've always done when life pressed down on me. I leaned on my faith. Every morning for the past 10 years since my wife passed, I've started my day the same way. A cup of black coffee, a wooden chair on the porch of my cabin, and my Bible open on the same page. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land. I'd read those words 1,000 times, but on the morning of Isabel's wedding, they struck me differently. I thought about how far Dana had drifted from them, how Eli had never once looked me in the eye with respect, and how Isabel, sweet Isabel, was caught in the middle, too afraid to stand against her mother. Faith told me not to explode. Faith told me to wait to let truth reveal itself, because truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply people try to bury it. Still, I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt. The wedding was being held at the St. Julian Hotel and Spa, the most expensive venue in Boulder. $65,000 just for the space, the flowers, the string quartet. A ballroom with crystal chandeliers, gold-trimmed chairs, and a menu where each plate cost more than a week's groceries. Dana and Eli strutted through the place like royalty, their designer clothes pressed sharp, their smiles rehearsed for the cameras. And me, I was tucked away in the corner, treated like a blemish they couldn't quite scrub out. As I stood there in my old navy blue suit, I thought back on the checks I'd written over the years. $42,000 for Dana's tuition at Stanford. Another $18,000 for Eli when his business hit a rough patch. A down payment on their first house in Denver. The vacations I helped fund, the car payments I covered when they said money was tight. Hundreds of thousands of dollars poured into their lives. And now they looked at me as if I were some backwoods relic too shabby to be seen in their photographs. I'll admit something here, I almost left. I almost walked out of that ballroom, got into my old Ford pickup, and drove back to my cabin where the mountains don't care what suit you wear. But then I remembered my faith again, that verse about honor. And I realized something. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the clothes. It was about dignity. Theirs and mine. If I left, Dana would never learn. Eli would never face the truth. Isabel would never see that her grandfather was a man who stood tall, not a shadow to be hidden in the back row. So I stayed. And I prayed quietly under my breath. I prayed for strength to hold my tongue. I prayed for wisdom to know when to speak. And I prayed for patience because I knew somewhere deep in my bones that the right moment would come. It always does. And when it did, it wouldn't be me who looked ashamed in those photographs. It would be them. The days leading up to Isabel's wedding should have been filled with joy. A grandfather watching his granddaughter step into a new chapter that's supposed to be a blessing. But for me, every phone call, every meeting with Dana and Eli felt like one more reminder that I didn't belong. It started small the way it always does. 2 weeks before the wedding, I heard Dana on the phone with the wedding planner. She thought I wasn't listening. My dad only owns 2 suits, she said, lowering her voice like it was some terrible secret. Both are well dated. We can't have him ruining Isabel's photos. Can you make sure the photographer knows to keep him in the back? Keep him in the back. Those 4 words cut deeper than any insult. Like I was a prop to be managed, not the man who once carried her on my shoulders through Red Rocks Park. Not the man who signed the tuition checks that got her through Stanford when Eli was still fumbling through sales jobs. And Eli, he wasn't any better. I caught him one evening at Isabel's rehearsal dinner, standing with two of his golf buddies near the bar. He was laughing, holding his whiskey glass like it was part of his costume. My father-in-law, he said, lives in some wooden shack outside town. Old truck, same suit for every event. We're trying to make sure he doesn't stick out too badly in the photos. But hey, every family has their charity case, right? They laughed, and I stood there 10 feet away, my hands shaking but my face calm. A charity case. That's what I'd become in the story Eli told his friends. I thought back to the checks I'd written for him over the years. $25,000 when his startup collapsed. $12,000 more when he wanted to invest in some idea that never saw daylight. The vacations he couldn't afford, but insisted Isabel deserved Cancun, Maui, Aspen. Who quietly paid those bills when Dana called in tears, me, the so-called charity case. And it didn't stop there. At the final dress fitting, Dana pulled me aside. "Dad," she said in that tone she uses when she's trying to make cruelty sound like kindness, "could you maybe not stand too close to Isabel during the photos? We just want everything to look polished, professional, elegant, professional, elegant." Words that meant expensive. Words that meant I didn't qualify. I nodded, but inside something hardened. Because you can forgive ignorance. You can forgive pride. But when your own daughter treats you like a liability, like a stain she has to edit out of her perfect day, that's when forgiveness starts to run thin. I went home that night and pulled out my old leather notebook, the one I've kept for decades. Every loan, every gift, every temporary help I'd given Dana and Eli, I wrote down. College tuition, $42,000. House down payment, $35,000. Eli's failed business, $25,000. Vacations and emergencies, another $20,000 at least. Over $100,000. 100,000 reasons for them to show me respect. Instead, they gave me whispered conversations, fake smiles, and quiet plans to crop me out of the photos. I sat at my wooden kitchen table, the same one my wife and I bought 40 years ago, and I stared at those numbers. All the money I had poured into their lives. And I realized something that made me colder than the mountain air outside. If they could treat me this way when they thought I was poor, what would they do if they knew I was rich? The answer was simple. They'd take, and they'd take, and they'd never look back. That night, I made up my mind. The gift I had planned, the check for $5 million tucked in a white envelope, suddenly felt like the biggest mistake of my life. The white envelope sat on my desk like a promise. Inside was a cashier's check for $5 million made out to Isabel and her new husband. I'd gone to the bank myself, signed it in careful handwriting, even added a note on the memo line for your new beginning. With love, Grandpa. When I first had it printed, I imagined the look on Isabel's face. Tears, laughter, maybe even that long, tight hug where she'd whisper, "Thank you, Grandpa. I'll never forget this." For weeks, that thought had carried me through the quiet evenings in my cabin. It was supposed to be my way of honoring her, of giving her a foundation so strong no storm could shake it. But after what Dana and Eli had said, after hearing myself described as a charity case, after being told I was unfit for the photographs, I couldn't do it. I opened the envelope that night, staring at the numbers. 5 million. The ink seemed to mock me. Would you really reward cruelty with this much money? Would you really hand a fortune to people who see you as a blemish? No. Not anymore. I slid the check back into the safe and reached for my regular checkbook. The one I'd used for grocery bills, tithe offerings at church, and birthday gifts for the last 30 years. The paper was thinner, the numbers smaller. But in that moment, it felt heavier than gold. With slow, deliberate strokes, I wrote, "Pay to the order of Isabel and Matthew Grant, $250. Memo line, figure it out together. $250. Enough to buy the kind of wedding dress my late wife wore. The same amount I had once spent on Dana's dress decades ago when she was a young bride with stars in her eyes. It was symbolic. A reminder that marriages don't stand on designer gowns and ballroom chandeliers. They stand on grit, faith, and the will to work side by side. When I signed my name at the bottom, my hand didn't shake. For the first time in months, I felt steady. I slipped that smaller check into a plain envelope. No gold lettering, no bank seal. Just my handwriting. It wasn't $5 million, but it carried something worth more than money. A lesson. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the wind against the cabin walls. Outside, the Rockies stood unshaken, just as they had my entire life. Mountains don't care about Armani suits or Instagram photos, and neither should I. But make no mistake, this wasn't about bitterness. It wasn't about revenge. It was about boundaries. For 72 years, I had worked, sacrificed, and given until there was nothing left to give. And in return, I had been told to hide in the shadows of my own family story. Not anymore. That night, as I put the $250 envelope into my jacket pocket, I whispered a quiet prayer. Not for me, but for them. Lord, open their eyes. Let them see what really matters before it's too late. Because here's the truth. Money can build a house, but it can't build respect. It can fund a wedding, but it can't teach gratitude. And it can buy suits, flowers, and photographers, but it can't buy dignity. So when I walked into that $65,000 ballroom in my old Navy suit, I wasn't carrying $5 million in my pocket. I was carrying something stronger, the decision to stand tall, even if it meant standing alone. And let me ask you, friend, what would you have done? Sitting there realizing your family only valued you for your image. Because I promise you, this the moment I decided to swap those checks. The story of Isabel's wedding was no longer about flowers, dresses, or chandeliers. It was about me. And it was about to change everything. The morning of Isabel's wedding broke crisp and golden over Boulder, the kind of September day photographers dream about. The mountains stood proud against a cloudless sky, and the air smelled faintly of pine drifting in from the foothills. By 3 o'clock, I was pulling my old Ford pickup into the valet line outside the St. Julian Hotel and Spa. One by one, gleaming machines rolled up ahead of me, sleek black Mercedes sedans, Teslas with doors opening like wings, even a bright red Maserati that purred like a jungle cat. My truck's engine sputtered as I eased it forward, a reminder of its 200,000 miles. The valet gave me a look I knew well, half pity, half disgust. Inside, the ballroom was dripping with extravagance. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms of light across the marble floor. Each table was draped in ivory silk, topped with floral arrangements, so tall they blocked half the guests' faces. The bar boasted champagne bottles stacked like a pyramid, Dom Perignon labels gleaming. I overheard someone say the catering bill alone topped $400 per guest. Multiply that by 250 people and you get the kind of number most families would call a mortgage. And yet in this kingdom of glass and gold, I was nothing more than a blemish. Dana had assigned me to table 9, far from the head table. It wasn't tucked into a dark corner, it was worse than that. It was in full view, but positioned just far enough away that I was part of the scenery, not the story. Around me sat distant cousins, a few old acquaintances, and 2 of Eli's co-workers, who'd been seated like afterthoughts. From my chair, I could see Dana and Eli at the head table basking in the glow of their chosen crowd. Eli's tuxedo was tailored within an inch of his life. Dana's gown shimmered like liquid gold under the chandeliers. Their smiles were wide rehearsed, perfect for Instagram. And Isabel, my sweet granddaughter. She looked radiant. Her dress floated like a cloud as she moved between guests, her laughter ringing clear as bells. For a moment, my heart softened. Maybe she still saw me the way she used to back when she was just a girl in pigtails riding the tractor on my ranch. But then I noticed something. Whenever Isabel's eyes met mine across the room, Dana would step in quickly, pulling her toward another group, another camera, another conversation. I was a shadow they didn't want caught in the frame. The humiliation didn't stop there. As the photographer lined people up for family portraits, I heard the instructions whispered loud enough to sting Mr. Whitaker. "We'll put you on the far left." "Yes, perfect, now everyone else squeeze in tight. That way, if we need to crop the edges for prints, crop me out." My daughter had planned this down to the angle of the camera lens. I smiled politely, as if I didn't understand. But inside something was boiling. Later, as dinner began, I overheard Eli speaking to his best man near the bar. His voice carried maybe because he'd had a few drinks. "Howard. He's harmless. Poor guy barely scrapes by. Wears the same suit to every event. Dana and I just try to manage him so he doesn't embarrass Isabel. Every family has dead weight, right dead weight. That's what I'd become." I sipped my water, hands steady though my stomach twisted. Around me, guests laughed over plates of salmon and filet mignon. Silver cutlery clinked, champagne glasses chimed. It was the sound of celebration, but for me every note rang hollow, because in that ballroom surrounded by wealth and sparkle, I wasn't a father. I wasn't a grandfather. I was an obstacle. A problem to be managed. I sat there invisible in plain sight and thought about the check in my pocket. $250. Just enough to remind them that the man they'd tried to erase had the power to rewrite the story. And before the night was over, that's exactly what I was going to do. I sat there at table 9, surrounded by half-strangers, the noise of laughter and clinking glasses pressing down like a weight. My food was untouched. I pushed the salmon around my plate with my fork, watching the head table sparkle under the chandeliers. That's when I felt it, the old ache in my chest. Not from the heart, no, but from the soul. The ache of being cast aside by the very people you gave your life to. So I reached into the inner pocket of my suit. Not for the check, not yet, but for something far smaller. It was a little worn card the size of a playing card, edges frayed from years of handling. My wife had given it to me on our 40th anniversary. On the front was a mountain sunrise. On the back, a verse, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." I rubbed the card between my fingers, feeling the texture of the creases. Those words had carried me through layoffs, through lean years, through the grief of burying my wife. And now, in this glittering ballroom where I was being treated like dead weight, They reminded me of something vital. My worth doesn't come from their opinion. Dana and Eli could shuffle me to the edge of photos, but they couldn't erase the life I'd lived. They couldn't erase the bridges I'd built, the men I'd employed, the pews I'd nailed down in 2 country churches. They couldn't erase the nights I stayed awake with sick children, or the mornings I left before dawn so my family could eat. God had seen it all, even if my daughter pretended she hadn't. I closed my eyes for a moment, whispering under the clamor of music and chatter, "Lord, give me patience, give me courage, and give me the right words when the time comes." Because I knew it was coming. The speeches, the toasts, the moment when every eye would turn to me expecting a tired old man to mutter something sentimental before fading back into the wallpaper. That's what they thought. But faith told me otherwise. Faith told me this was the moment God had been preparing me for the moment. Not to lash out in anger, but to stand tall in truth. When I opened my eyes, I caught Isabel's gaze across the room. For a flicker, just a heartbeat, her expression softened. It was the same look she used to give me when she was 10 years old, curled up with a blanket on my porch, listening to the wind in the pines. And then just as quickly, Dana touched her arm, pulling her back into laughter and champagne. I set the card down on the table and straightened my old navy suit. The very suit Dana had mocked. The very suit Eli said made me look like a charity case. Maybe it was outdated. Maybe it wasn't Armani or tailored silk. But it was clean. It was pressed. And it was mine. I lifted my glass of water in a quiet toast to no one but myself. "Let the storm come," I whispered. Because when it did, I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. I was going to stand, Bible verse in my pocket, $70 million in my bank account, and dignity in my heart. And when my turn at the microphone came, I would not be the embarrassment they imagined. I would be the lesson they never forgot. The ballroom quieted as the DJ tapped the microphone. The chatter dimmed, champagne glasses were set down, and every head turned toward the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the DJ announced, "it's time for the wedding toasts. First, we'll hear from the best man." Connor, one of Eli's polished golf buddies, stood and delivered a safe, forgettable speech about loyalty and late nights in college. He got a few laughs, a polite round of applause, and sat back down, looking pleased with himself. Then came Isabel's maid of honor, her college roommate. She told stories about Pinterest boards, late-night talks, and manifesting the perfect husband. People dabbed their eyes. The champagne flowed. Eli's father spoke next, booming about tradition and hard work, his Armani suit gleaming under the chandeliers. His words were smooth, rehearsed, exactly the kind of respectable toast that fit their carefully staged aesthetic. And then at last, the DJ turned his gaze toward me. "Now we invite the father of the bride, Mr. Howard Whitaker, to say a few words." Every pair of eyes swung to table 9. Phones lifted into the air, recording. I rose slowly, brushing down the front of my old navy suit, the same one they had whispered about for weeks. My shoes squeaked faintly on the marble as I made my way toward the stage. I could see Dana's tight smile, anxious, brittle. Eli leaned back, smirking like he expected me to stumble through a few bumbling lines. "Isabel, my sweet granddaughter." Her eyes were wide, her hands clasped together in hope and fear. I reached the microphone, adjusted it down an inch, and let the silence settle. "Thank you." I began, my voice low but steady. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate Isabel and Matthew." Polite applause followed. I nodded, waited, and then continued. You know, being a father, being a grandfather, it teaches you sacrifice. You work long hours so your children can have shorter ones. You drive old trucks so they can drive something reliable. You skip vacations so they can see the ocean. That's what love looks like when it rolls up its sleeves. I paused, scanning the room. Heads nodded. A few older guests smiled knowingly. Donna's expression tightened. But sometimes I said my voice firming love teaches a lesson you never meant to teach. Sometimes your giving becomes expected. Sometimes your sacrifices turn invisible. And sometimes the very people you carried on your shoulders grow up believing you're not good enough to stand beside them. The ballroom was still. I could feel the weight of every breath. 3 days ago, I continued, my daughter told me I would ruin her photographs. That my old suit wasn't fit for her perfect day. That I was in her words an embarrassment. A ripple moved through the guests. Dana's cheeks flushed crimson. Eli shifted in his seat, suddenly very interested in the floor. I let the silence hang before I leaned in, my voice dropping lower. She wasn't wrong. I am wearing an old suit. Not Armani. Not custom. Just the same navy blue suit I've worn to graduations, funerals, and milestones for over a decade. But I want you all to know something. I reached into my inside pocket, feeling the thin paper against my chest. This suit may not cost much, but the man wearing it isn't broke. A murmur swept through the room. I pulled out the folded slip of paper, a printed copy of my bank statement. 3 years ago, I sold the company I built from nothing. And I didn't just sell it, I walked away with $70 million. $70 million sitting quietly in my account, while my family thought I was living on scraps. Gasps, whispers. The shimmer of sequins and pearls turned to stunned faces. And yet I continued holding up the page when I asked for help with a suit, not a gift, not a loan, just help. My daughter told me I was an embarrassment. So tonight I am standing here to say this money can buy suits. It can buy photographers. It can buy chandeliers and champagne. But it cannot buy respect. I glanced at Dana, whose eyes brimmed with panic. Isabel's lips trembled. Eli looked like he'd swallowed his own tongue. I took a deep breath, steady as the mountains outside. My gift tonight was going to be $5 million. A sharp intake of breath rolled across the room. Phones tilted higher, eager to capture every word. But after what I've seen, after what I've heard, that gift has changed. And with that, I reached for the smaller envelope tucked in my other pocket, the one holding only $250. I laid it gently on the microphone stand. This, I said, is what respect looks like when it's been whittled down to scraps. Because if I'm not worth standing beside in a photograph, I'm certainly not worth $5 million in your bank account. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Dana buried her face in her hands. Isabel's eyes filled with tears, and I stood tall, gripping the microphone, ready to deliver the rest. I held the smaller envelope up between my fingers. Under the chandeliers, it looked almost fragile, plain white paper against all that gold and silk. But in that moment, it weighed more than any $5 million check ever could. You see, I said, my voice carrying across the stunned room, this gift right here isn't about money. It's about a lesson. Respect doesn't come in dollar signs. It comes in how you treat the people who've walked before you, who've given their lives so you could stand taller. And if you can't treat them with dignity, then you don't deserve their blessing. I laid the envelope gently on the microphone stand. $250. That's my gift tonight. About the price of the wedding dress I bought for Dana when she was a bride. Back then, it was enough to start a marriage. And maybe, Isabel, if you and Matthew remember that truth, it will be enough for you too. Gasps rippled across the ballroom. I saw heads turning, phones, still raised mouths hanging open. Guests whispered behind jeweled hands. The band in the corner had fallen silent, their instruments frozen mid-note. At the head table, Dana looked stricken. Her painted smile collapsed into panic. She shook her head in tiny, frantic movements, mouthing, "Stop, Dad, please." Eli gripped her arm, his own face pale, the smug grin finally wiped clean. But I wasn't finished. "Before you judge me too harshly," I said, "remember this. I had a different envelope in my pocket when I walked in tonight. That envelope held $5 million. Enough to buy houses, pay debts, and carry Isabel into her future with more security than most young couples will ever know." A collective murmur swelled. People leaned forward, eyes wide, hearts pounding. I reached into my inside pocket and drew out the second envelope, the heavy one from the bank with embossed lettering. For a heartbeat, I held it up, letting everyone see the seal. The room crackled with tension. Dana's eyes widened, hope flickering. And then slowly, deliberately, I tore the envelope clean in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the silence like thunder. Gasps and cries erupted. Someone actually shouted, "Oh my God." Dana covered her mouth, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Eli lurched halfway to his feet before sinking back down, powerless. Isabel stood frozen, her face a mixture of shock and heartbreak. I let the torn halves fall onto the table, soft as feathers. "Money comes and goes," I said quietly, my voice steady. "But character is forever. You wanted me cropped out of the pictures. You wanted me invisible, tucked away so your friends wouldn't see. Well, now they'll see. They'll see the truth and they'll remember it long after the champagne is gone." I scanned the room one last time. I didn't come here tonight to embarrass anyone. But sometimes the only way to teach respect is to stop rewarding disrespect. And so this is my final gift, a reminder that dignity cannot be bought, and it cannot be faked. The silence was suffocating. Then came the murmurs, the flashes of phone cameras, the sound of whispers flying like sparks across the ballroom. The story was already leaving this room, racing out into the world. I set the microphone back into its stand. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't pound. For the first time in years, I felt light. And as I turned and walked away from that stage, past the chandeliers and silk gowns and champagne glasses, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: they had tried to erase me. But after tonight, I was unforgettable. The moment I stepped away from that microphone, the ballroom descended into chaos. People weren't just whispering anymore. They were buzzing hands, flying phones lit up like a constellation of judgment. The torn halves of that $5 million envelope lay on the head table like ashes after a fire. And in a way, that's what it was, the burning down of an illusion Dana and Eli had tried to build. I saw Dana collapse into her chair, her golden gown shimmering under the chandeliers as she buried her face in her hands. The mascara she'd applied so carefully now ran in streaks down her cheeks. Eli, usually so full of smug charm, sat stiff and pale, his jaw clenched tight, his knuckles white against the linen tablecloth. And Isabel, my granddaughter, She just stood there, her bouquet trembling in her hands, tears brimming in her eyes. She wasn't crying for the money, not yet. She was crying because the image she had carried of her family had just shattered in front of 250 witnesses. The photographer, to his credit, kept snapping pictures. I imagine he realized these would be the shots people remembered, not the staged smiles and champagne flutes, but the truth spilling raw across every face. As I walked back to table 9, guests leaned away, murmuring in shock. Some gave me wide-eyed looks of admiration, others of horror. But no one looked at me like I was invisible anymore. Aunt Margaret, my late wife's sister, reached for my hand as I passed. "Howard," she whispered, "that was the bravest thing I've ever seen." At my table, the cousins and acquaintances I'd been seated with clapped me on the back, their voices hushed, but firm. "Good on you," one man said. "Took guts to do that." I nodded, but I didn't linger. I had no appetite for salmon or champagne. I wanted air, real, fresh air. So I walked out of that glittering ballroom, through the grand lobby with its marble floors and perfumed air, and pushed open the heavy glass doors into the cool Colorado evening. The street outside was quiet, lined with maples whose leaves had just begun to turn gold and crimson. My old Ford pickup sat at the edge of the valet line, the lone relic among a fleet of polished imports. I slipped the ticket to the valet, who handed me the keys with a shaky hand. "Sir," he said softly, "what you did in there?" Well, my dad's been through something similar. Respect, it's everything. I drove off slow, the city lights reflecting off my windshield, my mind oddly calm. Behind me, I knew the reception was unraveling. I pictured Dana trying to explain away what had just happened. Eli spinning some excuse Isabel caught in the middle of it all. But no excuse could undo the sight of me tearing that check in half. No story could erase the sound of my voice declaring my worth. Word would spread of that, I was certain. By morning, the story would be on every guest's social media feed. A father humiliated by his daughter revealing himself to be a secret millionaire at her child's wedding. If they thought I was embarrassing before they hadn't seen anything yet. But here's the thing, I didn't feel embarrassed. I felt free. Free from decades of carrying their expectations. Free from being treated like a wallet instead of a man. Free from the weight of giving without gratitude. By the time I reached the foothills, the night sky stretched wide above me, stars scattering like diamonds across black velvet. I rolled down the window and breathed in the mountain air. Crisp, honest. It smelled like home. For the first time in years, I wasn't replaying conversations in my head, wondering what I could have done differently. I wasn't calculating what I still owed, what I still needed to give. Instead, I thought of my wife. I thought of the mornings we spent on the porch, her hand in mine, her voice soft as she read me scriptures over coffee. She used to tell me, "Howard, one day, you'll have to choose between peace and pleasing people. Don't be afraid to choose peace." Tonight, I finally understood. I had chosen peace, and though I drove home alone, I didn't feel lonely. Not anymore. Because dignity has a way of keeping you company. When I pulled into my driveway, the cabin stood waiting, porch light glowing warm against the night. I parked, stepped out, and listened to the crickets and the wind rustling through the pines. No applause. No chandeliers, just quiet. And in that quiet, I realized something. The wedding may have been theirs, the money may have been mine, but the respect, The respect was God's gift to me, and I wasn't about to give it away again. The next morning, I sat on the porch of my cabin with a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and my Bible in the other. The sun was just climbing over the Rockies, painting the peaks in gold. Down in Boulder, people were probably still talking about last night, still whispering about the old man who tore up $5 million in front of a ballroom full of witnesses. And you know what? I didn't mind. Let them talk. Let the videos spread. For 72 years, I'd been quiet, steady, the man in the background who built bridges and houses but never asked for applause. If the world finally saw me now, they'd see me for what I truly was: not a fool, not an embarrassment, but a man who refused to be erased. Dana hadn't called. Neither had Eli. I half expected my phone to light up with frantic messages, excuses about stress, or desperate pleas to reconsider. But it stayed silent. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. They weren't ready to face the truth yet. But Isabel was different. Late in the afternoon, just as the sun dipped low and painted the mountains crimson, a car pulled into my gravel driveway. Isabel stepped out still in her wedding dress, the hem dusty from the previous night. Her eyes were red, her hair loose, but when she saw me, she managed a trembling smile. "Grandpa," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." I stood and opened my arms, and she fell against me sobbing. She cried not just for the lost money, but for the years of disrespect, the way her mother had twisted the story, the way I'd been made small so that others could feel big. "I never wanted you hidden," she said through tears. "I wanted you beside me." "But Mom," I placed a hand on her shoulder and shook my head. "Isabel, you don't owe me explanations. You owe yourself honesty. Remember this: a marriage can survive without chandeliers and champagne, but it cannot survive without respect." That's what I tried to teach last night. She nodded, wiping her tears. "I understand now." We sat on the porch together as the stars began to prick the sky. For the first time since the chaos of that wedding, I felt hope. Maybe the cycle could break. Maybe Isabel would carry something better into her new life, something her parents had forgotten. Later, after she drove away, I went inside and pulled out my safe. Inside were bank papers, legal documents, and another envelope I had prepared long before. This one wasn't addressed to Dana or Eli. It wasn't for Isabel either. It was for the Whitaker Foundation, a scholarship fund I had quietly set up months ago, but never funded. As I looked at the blank check, I knew exactly what I was going to do. $5 million. The same amount I'd once intended for Isabel's wedding gift. Only now it would go towards scholarships for young builders, welders, and carpenters' kids who worked with their hands the way I once did, kids who needed a chance. Because if my own family couldn't honor sacrifice, maybe strangers would. I signed the check, placed it in the envelope, and whispered a prayer. "Lord, let this money build something that lasts. Not just houses, but futures." Then I set the envelope aside and poured myself another cup of coffee. The night air slipped cool through the open window. Crickets sang. Somewhere far below, the city lights twinkled like fallen stars. I leaned back, letting the peace wash over me. My daughter wanted me cropped out of her photographs. Eli wanted me invisible at their glittering table. But faith had carried me through storms before, and it carried me now. Because respect, true respect, doesn't fade with age. It grows stronger the moment you decide you won't let anyone take it from you. So here's what I'll leave you with. If you were me, would you forgive or would you walk away for good? As for me, I've already chosen. I walked away. And in doing so, I finally walked into freedom.